Why was she always the one they didn't listen to? 3 years of service, top of her sniper class, flawless field evaluations. Yet every time Emma Lawson spoke up, the room went quiet, then moved on like she'd never opened her mouth. That morning at Fort Liberty, the air smelled of gun oil and desert heat. It was barely 800 hours and the armory was already an oven. Emma sat cross-legged on a concrete floor, her disassembled rifle spread neatly across a tan cloth, sunlight cutting through the window like a laser on her hands. The weapon gleamed in sections: receiver, barrel, scope, bolt, each piece spotless. Each motion she made deliberate, efficient, almost ritual. Outside, the Arizona wind scraped dust across the base. Inside, the only sounds were the faint hum of air conditioning and the precise clicks of metal on metal. She'd always loved this part, the calm before the noise, the quiet where control still existed. But something about the morning felt wrong. She couldn't name it yet, only that her stomach had that tight, electric pull that came before bad things happened. The door creaked open. Staff Sergeant Chris Hamilton leaned against the frame, blocking the light. 6'2", the kind of man who treated mirrors like mission briefings, built like a wall, grinning like he knew something funny about the universe that you didn't. "Briefing in 10, he said. "Colonel wants everyone in the JOC, even you, Lawson." "Even me," she echoed, not looking up from her bolt assembly. Hamilton smirked. "Yeah, for the optics." She didn't answer, didn't need to. The jab wasn't new. Hamilton had the same sniper designation she did, only his came with deployments and medals. Hers came with armory maintenance and paperwork. He nodded toward her rifle. "You hear about Echo Valley?" "I heard enough," she said. "Narrow approach, high ridges, limited egress routes. Looks like a kill box on a map." "Or a turkey shoot," Hamilton countered. 300 SEALs going in. Full sweep, one-day op, clean and simple." Emma looked up then, eyes steady, calm. "Simple," she repeated. "That's what people say before something breaks." He laughed, the sound dry and condescending. "That's why I'm out there and you're not. Don't be late for the briefing, Sergeant. Wouldn't want them to miss their diversity checkbox." The door shut behind him. She exhaled slowly, the faintest tremor escaping her chest. Then she set her rifle down, stood, and looked out the small armory window. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the wire. Beautiful, cruel, indifferent. The kind of land that didn't care who thought they were ready for it. She learned that lesson too many times. The briefing room was a world away from the desert heat, cold air, fluorescent lights, and the hum of machines tracking lives on screens. 23 Marines and Navy personnel filled the rows of folding chairs, uniforms crisp, expressions sharp. Colonel Marcus Reed stood at the front, pointer in hand, his pressed uniform immaculate despite the heat outside. He looked like a recruitment poster, but colder. "Gentlemen," he began, then hesitated, "and Sergeant Lawson." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the room. Emma didn't react. Reed gestured to the massive 3D terrain map of Echo Valley projected behind him. "We have operational approval for the sweep. Intel confirms a significant training camp in this sector. Our objective is to locate and neutralize the threat." Emma studied the projection, her eyes tracing the contour lines. The valley looked like a wound between two ridges, narrow, steep, exposed. A perfect ambush site. The colonel's voice droned on, full of certainty that only came from people far away from bullets. Emma raised her hand. Reed noticed her, visibly irritated. "Yes, Sergeant." "Sir," she said evenly, "those ridge lines provide ideal overwatch for ambush positions. If enemy forces are dug in, we'll be caught in a crossfire with no maneuver options. Limited cover on the valley floor. 2 choke points, north and south. It's a natural kill zone." The room went quiet. A few officers glanced at her, uneasy. Hamilton rolled his eyes. Reed's jaw tightened. "Thank you for your assessment, Sergeant Lawson. However, Intelligence has vetted this operation thoroughly. The tactical advantages outweigh hypothetical concerns. With respect, sir, nothing hypothetical about contour lines. Her tone wasn't defiant, just factual, but that was enough. Sergeant, Reed snapped. Your input is noted. Focus on your assigned communication support. Leave strategy to those with the appropriate experience. A thin silence followed. Reed moved on, pretending she wasn't there. Only one person didn't look away. Major Lisa Hayes, the intelligence officer. Her expression was faintly sympathetic but distant, like someone watching a car crash they couldn't stop. Emma closed her notebook. Understood, sir. The rest of the briefing blurred. Maps, call signs, operational codes, time schedules. By the end, every officer seemed reassured. The plan was airtight, clean on paper, impossible to question. But Emma wasn't reassured. She saw something none of them wanted to. 300 men about to walk into terrain designed to kill them. Her quarters were quiet when she returned. Bare plywood walls, a cot, a small desk with her laptop, and a faded photo pinned to the wall. Her parents. Her father in desert camo, smiling with dust on his face. Her mother in army medical uniform, eyes bright and tired. Both gone before Emma turned 20. She stared at their picture, whispering softly, "You tell me to keep my mouth shut, wouldn't you?" Her mother would have smiled sadly. Her father would have told her to trust the math, not the men. So she opened her laptop and pulled up the operational map again. The data flowed across the screen: elevation, wind, humidity, distance, numbers and topography. The numbers told the truth that command wouldn't hear. Echo Valley was a trap. If she'd been the enemy, she'd do exactly what the terrain invited. Heavy weapons on the ridges, interlocking fields of fire, wait until the SEALs were halfway in, then close the jaws. She closed her laptop. The sound echoed in the tiny room. Sometimes the worst part of being right was knowing no one would believe you until it was too late. Dawn came like fire over the desert. Emma stood outside the operations center as the SEALs geared up, 30 vehicles, rows of men checking weapons, strapping on gear, laughing the way soldiers laugh before things go bad. The air was thick with exhaust and tension. Dust rose like smoke as engines roared to life. Captain Ethan Parker walked among them, young, composed, eyes sharp. You could tell he was the kind of leader men followed, not because of rank, but because he never asked them to do what he wouldn't. He caught her watching, walked over. "Sergeant Lawson, right?" His voice was steady, respectful. "Yes, sir. You were the one who questioned the terrain yesterday." She hesitated. "Yes, sir, I still think it's a problem." He studied her face, not with irritation but with thought. "You've studied the map." "Every line of it. I've got notes on elevation, wind, and choke points. Sir, anyone holding the high ground will have total control of that valley." For a moment Parker didn't speak, then he gave a half-smile. "You always this direct?" "Only when it matters." He nodded. Sometimes the people who see the clearest are the ones nobody's looking at. Then he walked back to his men. For the first time in 3 years, someone had listened. Just one officer, but it was enough to make the morning feel a little less heavy. The convoy rolled out at 6:20, engines rumbling, vehicles vanishing into the desert like a line of steel bones disappearing into a throat. Emma watched them go, dust swallowing their taillights. She wanted to shout something, anything, but the words stuck in her chest. She turned and walked back into the Joint Operations Center. Banks of monitors lit the dark room. Radio chatter hummed low. The first drone feeds came online, grainy images of mountains and shadows. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And that was the part that scared her most. At 6:47 hours, the first contact came. The radio crackled. "Contact left, heavy fire from the ridge. RPGs incoming, multiple hostiles, west and east ridge. Emma froze. The calm of the room shattered. Officers shouted, screens flashed red, coordinates blinked like heart monitors. The video feed flared white with explosions, vehicles burning, men diving for cover. The valley lit up like a war film in fast forward. Parker's voice came through the static, steady but strained. Firebase, this is Alpha Actual, multiple elevated positions. We're pinned down. Heavy weapons, repeat, heavy weapons. Request immediate air support. Headquarters responded flatly. Alpha Actual, closest air assets 40 minutes out. Maintain defensive posture. 40 minutes. Emma looked at the tactical map, saw what Parker already knew. They didn't have 40 minutes. They barely had 10. The room turned into chaos. Officers barking orders, aides relaying casualty numbers. Colonel Reed's voice rose above the din. Get those birds moving. Establish suppression on the eastern ridge. Major Hayes whispered, they're too close. We can't strike without hitting friendlies. Reed ignored her. Emma's pulse thudded in her ears. She could hear the radio, hear men screaming, calling for medics, calling for cover. And she could see it on the map, the exact kill zone she'd warned about lighting up with red indicators. Her pen rolled off the desk. She didn't pick it up. Her hands were shaking. 300 SEALs. 30 vehicles. A perfect trap. The colonel's voice broke through again. They're maintaining defensive posture. Reinforcements are 40 minutes out. We hold until then. Emma whispered under her breath, they won't last 10. But no one heard her. No one ever did. Outside, the desert wind rose, carrying the sound of distant thunder, the kind that didn't come from clouds, but from gunfire echoing across stone. In the command center, the monitors flickered. One by one, red markers blinked, injured, pinned down, vehicles lost. And in that cold, fluorescent room, surrounded by men who'd stopped listening long ago, Emma Lawson made a decision she didn't yet understand. If command wouldn't act, she would, because orders might protect careers, but they wouldn't save lives. And somewhere out there, in the dust and chaos of Echo Valley, 300 men were about to die. Unless she broke every rule she'd ever sworn to follow. What do you do when the people in charge decide your friends are expendable? For Emma Lawson, that answer was suddenly, painfully clear. You disobey. You move. You stop asking permission to do the right thing. The Joint Operations Center was chaos. Radio chatter, shouting, officers circling like anxious ghosts over the tactical display. But to Emma, the sound faded, replaced by the hollow rhythm of her heartbeat and the single truth echoing through her mind. They were dying, and command was writing speeches. General Howard's voice crackled over the intercom, calm in that detached way senior officers learn. We are considering tactical withdrawal options. Repeat, tactical withdrawal. Tactical withdrawal. The phrase hit her like a slap, a euphemism for leaving 300 men to die in the dust. Major Hayes argued quietly, Sir, those SEALs are still combat effective. If we reinforce, we can. Major, the general cut her off. This isn't optimism versus pessimism. It's math. We can't justify additional losses. Emma felt something break inside her, a thread pulled too tight, finally snapping. She stood. Sir, she said, voice steady, there's another option. Every head turned. Even the air seemed to pause. Reed's glare could have frozen lava. Sergeant Lawson, you are not authorized to. The enemy's fire coordination is coming from the ridge lines, she said, ignoring him. If we eliminate their command elements, heavy weapons, spotters, and comm units, we can disrupt their coordination. Give our guys room to breathe. Reed's jaw clenched. We don't have sniper assets in position. You do now. The words came out before she could stop them, But once spoken, there was no turning back. I can make those shots. I've studied that terrain for months. I've logged every elevation, wind pattern, and line of sight. Give me authorization and I'll take position on Eagle Peak. From there, I can see the entire valley. For a second, the room was silent. Then Hamilton laughed. You alone, that's suicide. Emma met his eyes. Maybe, but it's better than murder by negligence. Reed took a step forward, face reddening. Absolutely not. You're a comm support asset, not a field operator. You are not authorized for combat. Howard's voice was quieter. How long to reach position? Emma turned to him. 4 hours. Another hour to set up. Range to targets between 800 and 3,000 meters. I'll need weather updates, but conditions are favorable. Reed spun toward his superior. Sir, this is absurd. She's not cleared for deployment. She's untested. She's the only one offering a plan, Hayes interrupted. Her tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise. And so far, she's been right about everything else. Howard hesitated, looking between them, the command chain cracking under the weight of indecision. Finally, he exhaled. No, we follow protocol, prepare withdrawal plans, that's final. Emma's hands curled into fists. Sir, with respect. That's an order, Sergeant Lawson. Return to your station. She stood there a moment longer, staring at the tactical display. Red blips, each one a life slowly blinking out. Reed leaned close, voice low enough only she could hear. You so much as step off base, I'll bury your career so deep no one will remember your name. Emma's reply was almost a whisper. Maybe that's the point. She left the command center without another word. Outside, the sun hit like a physical blow. The air shimmered with heat waves, the smell of fuel and dust thick enough to taste. Marines moved around her, oblivious, performing their routines while 300 men fought and bled in the mountains beyond. Her boots carried her to the armory. Sergeant First Class Park looked up from a dog-eared paperback. Need to sign out my rifle, Emma said. Park raised an eyebrow. In this heat, range time. Best time to train is when it's hardest, she replied evenly. He shrugged and slid the logbook across the desk. Knock yourself out. She signed the form. M40A6 rifle, 120 rounds, range finder, comms. Purpose, marksmanship qualification. Everything looked official. Everything sounded routine. Until she walked right past the range. Her pace quickened, pulse sinking with her steps. She crossed the compound, heading for the motor pool. The world seemed sharper now, colors brighter, sounds more distant. The strange clarity of people who have already accepted the cost. A Humvee idled near the gate, engine rumbling. Corporal Fletcher leaned over the hood, checking oil levels. Emma approached like she belonged there. Change of plans, Corporal. I need transport to Overwatch Post Sentinel. Priority tasking. Fletcher frowned. Ma'am, I don't have. Orders are being processed, she interrupted smoothly. This is time-sensitive comms equipment repair. Echo Valley Operation Relay. It wasn't a lie that mattered. What mattered was tone, confidence, the kind that made junior ranks obey before their brains caught up. Fletcher hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, when do we depart? Now. He climbed in. The Humvee lurched forward, rolling toward the outer gate. The guard barely looked up from his clipboard. A single salute, a wave, and they were through. Fort Liberty disappeared in the rearview mirror, fading into heat, haze, and regret. For a while, neither of them spoke. The road was a ribbon of dirt winding through stone canyons, the sky a hard white dome. The radio crackled with distant voices, updates, requests, the static of lives unraveling. 20 minutes out, Emma finally spoke. Drop me at the Eastern Trail Junction, then return to base. Report delivery to Sentinel complete. Fletcher glanced at her. Ma'am, there's no equipment in this vehicle. I know. And you're not going to Sentinel, are you? She looked out the window. No. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with realization and fear. Ma'am, if you're doing what I think you're doing, I should stop you. You should, Emma said quietly, but you won't. He didn't answer, but his hands tightened on the wheel. You've been listening to the radio traffic, she continued. You know what's happening out there. You know what command is about to do. Fletcher's jaw clenched. He was young but not naive. He'd seen enough to understand when leadership failed. I didn't see anything, he said finally. Equipment got delivered. You stayed at Sentinel for comms work. She met his eyes, gratitude flickering there. Appreciate it, Corporal. He shook his head. Don't thank me yet, ma'am. Thank me if you make it back. They stopped where the road split into two rough trails, the signpost half buried in sand. Beyond, the land rose sharply into the teeth of the mountains. Emma checked her gear. Rifle, ammo, radio, rangefinder, water, rations. Everything she needed to fight a war alone. She slung her pack across her shoulders. The Humvee idled beside her, engine growling like a caged animal. Fletcher looked out at the trail, nothing but heat and stone. How far you hiking? 12 clicks, most of it vertical. Jesus, he hesitated, you sure about this? No, she said, but I'm doing it anyway. He smiled, the kind of small, sad smile soldiers give when words are useless. Good luck, Sergeant. The Humvee turned back toward the base, tires spitting dust. Emma watched until the sound faded into wind. Then she turned toward the mountains. The sun was merciless, hammering against her shoulders. The first hour was easy, gentle slope, red rocks, the faint illusion that the climb wouldn't be that bad. But hour two stripped that illusion away. The path narrowed to a goat trail. Loose gravel shifted under her boots. Sweat ran down her spine, soaked her collar. Her rifle, 48 inches of precision steel, felt like it weighed 50 pounds. She paused in the shadow of an outcropping, breathing in steady counts. Her father's voice surfaced in memory, steady as it had been on those long hunting trips in Colorado. Small steps, Em. Don't fight the terrain. Let it carry you. Mountains don't care if you're tired. By the third hour, her arms burned, her legs ached, but her mind was clear. The radio clip to her vest whispered static, then voices. Captain Parker's tone, calm but strained. Firebase, this is Alpha Actual. Ammunition critical. Casualties at 60%. We're consolidating positions, but we can't hold. Static, then reads voice, cool and distant. Maintain position. Reinforcements are inbound. Emma almost laughed. Reinforcements that didn't exist. Orders written in cowardice. She shut off the command frequency. She couldn't listen to it anymore. The mountain grew steeper, forcing her to climb hand over hand. Gravel slid under her boots, each misstep threatening to send her backward. At one point she lost footing, hung by her fingertips, boots scraping against smooth stone, the void yawning below. For a heartbeat she thought she'd fall. Then instinct took over, find a foothold, shift weight. Don't panic. She hauled herself up, lungs burning, muscles trembling. At the top of the ridge she paused, looked out. The world spread beneath her, red desert stretching to infinity, the shimmer of Echo Valley miles away. A faint haze of smoke rose from it, like breath from a dying animal. Her chest tightened. They were still down there, still fighting. She took a long drink from her water bladder, the liquid warm and metallic. Then she kept moving. Hour 5. Wind replaced heat. The temperature dropped fast as she gained altitude. Her breath came shorter now, thin air biting her lungs. She checked her compass. Northeast, still on course. Eagle Peak lay ahead, a jagged spire stabbing into the blue. That was where she'd make her stand. The radio crackled again, faint beneath static. Master Sergeant Blackwood's voice, old, gravelly, breaking. Firebase, we've got wounded who won't make it through the night. Copy. We're out of ammo. I repeat, out of ammo. Emma stopped walking. Her hand trembled as she reached for the transmit key. Then she lowered it again. Not yet. Not until she was in position. Talking now wouldn't help, shooting might. She kept moving. By the time the sun began to dip, she'd been climbing for nearly 6 hours. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, her knees shaking from fatigue. But when she crested the final ridge and saw Eagle Peak rise above her, something inside her sparked alive. She was close. So close she could feel it. The shot, the line of sight, the geometry of rescue. The mountain didn't care about courage, but maybe the men down there would. She adjusted the strap of her rifle and started the final ascent, toward the peak, toward the valley, toward the moment when one disobedient Marine would decide the fate of 300 soldiers who never even knew her name. The wind tore at her jacket, the rocks cut her palms, but she didn't stop. Because orders could be rewritten. But a promise to protect, to act, to do what's right. That was carved into the soul. And Emma Lawson had run out of patience for waiting on permission. Why did the valley suddenly feel quieter when she finally settled into the scope? Silence wasn't peace. Silence was a held breath before an avalanche. Emma Lawson lowered herself into the shallow depression she'd found 30 feet below Eagle Peak's summit and let the rock swallow her shape. Her hands moved on muscle memory: mat, sandbag, bipod, rifle cradle. Each motion was an economy of motion born from sleepless training. The M40A6 fitted her like a second skin. She knew its balance, the faint eccentricity in its bolt, the feel of the trigger that had become part of the rhythm of her life. She had prayed to less reliable gods than these metal and wood pieces. Her first view through the scope was a study in survival and ruin. Echo Valley spread out like a battered blueprint, scorched vehicles, clusters of men huddled behind the meager relief of overturned Humvees, infrared strobes blinking like tiny, stubborn constellations. Muzzle flashes appeared and died, anonymous stars of violence. On the ridgelines opposite, silhouettes skulked between rocks, the enemy's positions discreetly placed, their forms taut and professional. The air between them hummed with the micro-mathematics of wind shear and bullet drop, with temperatures and humidity, and the invisible physics she had practiced, until her hands remembered them in sleep. She should have been thrilled. Instead, there was a tight, ugly thing inside her chest, guilt braided with a flat, stubborn fury. Guilt because she'd gone rogue. Fury because people in suits and silver bars had been willing to let men die because optics and metrics mattered more than lives. Those feelings had carried her up the mountain. Now they clung to her shoulders like the weight of her pack. She started the checklist. Rangefinder sweep, valley floor distances, ridge offsets, elevation differentials, wind readings, gusting from northwest at 12 knots low, a thermal reversal closer to the valley floor. Bullet flight time calculations, elevation clicks, mil-dot subtensions, Coriolis adjustments for long shots. She ran through them like a mantra until the numbers blurred and the world narrowed to the target and the space between her heartbeat and the trigger. She had a list of 17 priority targets burned into her notebook: heavy machine emplacements, mortar teams, suspected comm nodes, and the highest priority item, what she called the hub, the command node that coordinated the ambush. Remove the hub and the spokes would stutter. The math had always worked that way. She built her life on small truths and precise arcs of steel. Now the calculus had a human coefficient. "Why are you doing this?" she heard herself ask, not to anyone but to the stone and the wind and the photograph of her father tucked into the inner seam of her jacket. Because if she didn't, they'd die. Because her name meant nothing if it meant nothing to people who'd bled for a country that then chose spreadsheets over souls. She set her cheek to the stock. Her breathing slowed to a conditioned metronome: 3 counts in, 2 counts hold, follow through. The valley contracted into the black circle of the scope. She picked the first target, an M2-sized mount on the eastern ridgeline, the kind of heavy gun that had been chewing into a SEAL position for hours. Its tripod bristled like an insult. She whispered the variables, then squeezed. The suppressed rifle barked once. Through the scope she watched a man slump, the rise and fall of his chest arrested. For a moment she forgot to exhale. Then she chambered, reevaluated, clicked for wind, and fired again at the assistant trying to fetch cover. Two were down. The machine mount stopped speaking. She felt the beginning of something like hope, careful, surgical. Time stitched back together with intention. On her headset a voice came, brittle with relief. "Sierra Whiskey, this is Alpha Actual, identify." It was Captain Parker, voice taut as wire. "Staff Sergeant Emma Lawson, Marine Scout Sniper, operating without command authorization," she said simply. The truth landed like a live grenade in the open channel. She watched the reactions on her mental screen. She felt neither triumph nor fear, just a raw, focused clarity. "See you in hell," Parker said, softer than she expected. "You bought us breathing room." The first hour of engagement was a measured violence of geometry and restraint. She wasn't hunting for kills. She was interrupting rhythms, taking out the command node, then the comms officer who was aligning mortar fire, neutralizing the heavy weapons so the men below could shift pockets of earth into wedges of cover and make a phased withdrawal. Every shot was a tiny policy correction written in spent casings. Her hands did not shake until hour 3, when real exhaustion softened her edges. The sun had rolled, its angle changing ballistic numbers she had corrected for in advance. The valley below had become a slow choreography of pain and stubborn decision. SEALs moving in short bounds, medics dragging the wounded, some squads making a desperate run for consolidation points. The enemy adapted, spreading observation teams and counter-snipers. Someone with discipline began to hunt her with the same methodical patience she'd been bred to respect. Emma's mind ticked to a secondary, more human problem: ammunition. She had brought what she could, an excess by most standards for a single operator, but there were still only so many rounds that would pass through the barrel before it went silent. She rationed them like a miser guarding the last of his coins. Each shot had a purpose. No theater shots, no bravado, just the pure arithmetic of lives saved versus rounds expended. Night was the enemy's ally and an equalizer. Darkness wrapped the world in velvet and made thermal signatures the lingua franca of warfare. She swapped to night optics and watched the valley change into luminous ghosts, silhouettes spiking white on her screen. Her throat tightened. The enemy had begun to move under cover, bringing forward teams trained not to expose themselves but to unmask others. A hunched cluster of figures began to set up a counter-sniper overwatch across the spine. She labeled them on her internal map: 2 shooters, a spotter, and a radio node. Professional, dangerous. They'd been patient enough to be scary. She thought of Dalton, Gunnery Sergeant Dalton, his voice gravelly and direct in the stalking fields of Scout Sniper School. Patience separates snipers from shooters. He'd pushed her, harder than most instructors pushed anyone. He liked her because she was small and unassuming and moved like a ghost. He knew the world would make room for pity and underestimate her until she proved them wrong again. So she waited. The valley hummed with 1,000 radios. She sipped what remained of her water at measured intervals. Her fingers cramped around the bipod when she extended it for extended shots. Her eyes burned from the monocular. The counter-sniper's spotter shifted his weight. A thermal bloom betrayed him like a cheap secret. Emma exhaled slowly, brought the crosshairs to bear on his shoulder where he held binoculars. The rifle made a soft exclamation. The spotter hit the ground in a muted heap. The shooter froze, eyes scanning for the sound. The shooter learned. He went prone. No more movement. Her radio vibrated. "Sierra Whiskey, we're moving. Can you cover the southern bound?" Parker's voice cut with logistics, a plan to consolidate into the southern egress point. "Copy, beginning overwatch covering fire." She never liked the term covering fire in an abstract sense. Cover, she knew, came from precision and timing. She worked through targets that would threaten the SEAL withdrawal, a mortar that had been scoring direct hits, a heavy machine position that oversaw the southern choke, and a radio operator who had kept the enemy's eyes connected. For every target she struck, there was the inevitable counterweight. Enemy chatter surged as they tried to triangulate her position. A hunter's voice, cross-checked in English with a deliberate cadence, hit one of the intercepted channels. "Sniper is neutralizing our positions from the eastern elevation. Locate and eliminate. Reward for the one who takes her alive, double rations." She felt something colder than fear at that, the calculation that she had made herself a prize. The enemy wanted her alive for reasons that made her skin crawl. Capture meant interrogation. Interrogation meant watching what they did to people who tried to save lives out of principle. The thought was a steel bar across her lungs. Time compressed. She moved positions more often now, alternating between small depressions, crawling like an animal through rock, using errant shadows and outcroppings as a body double. Each transition carried its own tiny terror, boots that might crunch, a breath that might betray, the exact wrong moonlight catching the edge of her scope. She learned to be a whisper. The enemy adapted in turn. They left traps, little signs of bait, caches of heat retention blankets staged near likely egresses, bait for thermal scanners. They left decoys, rocks wrapped in dark cloth set on ridgelines to trick thermal imagers. They began to coordinate with air assets of their own, laser-designated drones hunting for signatures beyond human vision. The battlefield had become a light show of lethal technology and old-fashioned human will. At the JOCC, back at base, her unauthorized presence on Eagle Peak had created a hurricane of bureaucratic noise. Fingers were pointing where they had never pointed before. Colonel Reed's face, set in that angle of indignation, had been replaced by something harder. The small, ugly panic of a man with a career in measurable outcomes watching one person make a numerically obvious difference. Major Hayes argued for her, blunt and fierce, the way someone argues when truth has teeth. "She's giving us a chance," she spat into the radio of Empire. "She's disrupting the ambush. Support her now." General Howard's voice came over the secure line, gravel and formality. "Support her. Handle legal ramifications later." Emma knew, almost through the detail of fatigue and scope glass, that the world was shifting in a way that would either save or condemn her. Politics would be written in ribbons of ink, and the men below would become a ledger either of success or sorrow. She felt the scale leaning toward life because she had chosen to act. It was a small, private moral victory that tasted suspiciously like relief. Her hands worked through the night, a machine of calculus and compassion. At some point, after what felt like 27 precise engagements and 100 small mercies, she lost track of time. The sky began to soften, stars contracted, the valley's edges lightened toward gray. Dawn would bring air assets and heavier ordnance. It would bring vindication or consequences. She set her last long-distance sight on a cluster across the southern ridge, a command node where a man with a headset barked orders into a radio. He was the stick that kept the snake animated. She inhaled, the air thin and treacherous, and for a moment the weight of all those early dismissals, the meetings where men humiliated her for asking questions, the nights of being sidelined, pressed in. This shot wasn't for revenge. It wasn't for rank or for applause. It was a ledger correction. It was math applied to human life. The rifle spoke once. The command node slumped. Confusion rippled through their ranks like a misfired chord. Orders stuttered. The enemy cohesion frayed, not gone, but wounded. On the headset, Captain Parker's voice broke like something raw and honest. "Sierra Whiskey, Alpha Actual, you've given us a chance. There are men down here who still have a future because you didn't ask permission. Fuck the orders." The profanity hit like a benediction. Emma didn't smile. She felt something quieter, an almost unbearable tiredness, and a brittle satisfaction that carried the shape of a promise kept. The valley below began to move differently. Men found new vectors, new pockets, and the wounded were shifted with a violence that was hospital and holy. Air support would arrive in minutes or hours, depending on the politics still cooking at the JOCC. The math had shifted enough for practical people to make bold choices. She closed her eyes for 2 breaths. The weight of remaining rounds counted like heartbeats. She had bought time, not salvation, not surety, just more moments where men could choose life. There was a long list of consequences waiting for her if she came down from Eagle Peak: courts, reprimands, perhaps prison. There were nights of lawyers and long, humiliating debriefs, but none of those futures had any purchase on the present. She set the scope back to the valley. Targets moved. Men survived. Somewhere below, an operator, bruised and tired, whispered someone's name into a radio with a tremor of hope. Maybe they were praying. Maybe they were just breathing louder. Emma could not tell the difference. In the thin pre-dawn blue, she gave herself permission to hold one small truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How do you keep moving when the whole world wants you to stop? Her body wanted to fold into the rock and sleep, let the mountain hold the weight of tiredness. Her mind kept calculating targets, timing, extraction windows, because if she stopped thinking, someone down in that valley would stop living. Dawn was not a dramatic reveal. It was a slow erasure of night, a soft gray that revealed consequences. The AH-64s she'd prayed for cleaved the sky in the distance like iron vultures, and for a terrifying second, she wondered whether their arrival would mean salvation or a new kind of danger. It took a generation of decisions in the JOCC for those Apache to be authorized. The math had shifted only after she'd proven that men on the ground could live if someone aimed true. The helicopters swept low and precise, sensors humming, rockets slung like teeth. Once the pilots had visuals, they sent down a terse mesh of encouragement over the open channel. Sierra Whiskey, outlaw element on station. Request targets. Parker's voice was tight with fatigue, gratitude, relief, 3 things that had to fit into one syllable. She peered through the scope. Apache were clinical eyes that turned thought into ordnance. She transmitted coordinates: a mortar pit carved into a notch on the western ridge, a heavy machine emplacement, a suspected secondary comm node. In less than a breath, the valley bloomed with flame and sound. Hellfires carved valleys of smoke where the enemy had been confident the night before. Chain gun tracers lashed rock like furious painters. The tactical map she'd held in her head moved, and for the first time in hours, it began to feel like it might match the map in the JOCC. But victory is not tidy. The enemy had been learning while she worked. They'd begun to use decoys and falsified heat signatures, pushing friendly sensors toward false positives. They'd also shifted resources. Teams that once hunted from ridgelines now moved like ghosts through folds of terrain, trying to close the net. She felt their attention settle on her like heat on skin. The intercepted chatter she'd heard at night had been a herald. The commander they called Carter had pivoted from annihilation to capture. Capture was worse, far worse, because it meant they valued what she represented. She had become an asset they wanted in hand, a bargaining chip and a symbol. Movement below was sharper now. Parker's teams moved in tighter, using the Apache suppression to collapse on the southern exit. Emma tracked the progress in the scope like someone watching a slow healing. She negated threats, sniper nests, a mortar that set up again in a blind, a spotter who thought he'd found safety behind a boulder. Each time she fired, she calculated not only ballistics but political effect. Fewer enemy shooters meant fewer opportunities for the hunters to track her later. And then came a new human variable she hadn't expected, an almost whispered transmission on a different frequency, in accented English, clipped and casual but with a cold edge. She is moving north. Drive her toward the cliff face. Don't kill her. We take her alive. Carter's voice carried through the static like a promise. Her stomach turned. They wanted prisoners, not corpses. The calculus had shifted to capture and torture or spectacle. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with altitude. That they wanted her alive made everything more dangerous, because living meant they study her, break her, and use what they learned. She packed a kit, caching non-essential items in a shallow depression. Blanket half a ration, a small medical kit, leaving bread crumbs that might either mislead or be used by someone less cautious. She kept the rifle, the rangefinder, the radio, and 37 rounds. That number 37 felt obscene. How many lives could that many rounds buy? It was impossible to quantify. She had learned the ugly shape of trade-offs, breaths for bullets, seconds for movement. The ridge she'd chosen offered options: small depressions, blind corners, an abrupt cliff that dropped into a ravine she knew could be descended if one had ropes and some skill. It would be foolish to stay where they could zero her thermals. It would be suicidal to run into the valley. The answer formed itself slowly: sheer into the cliff by separation, get lost in terrain where thermal imagers were less effective. The descent would be ugly. It might be the only chance. As she prepared, footsteps sounded on the spine, not the patient, silent boots of a sniper stalking. These were heavier, coordinated. Flashlights painted the ridge in cruel bands. They were close. She moved. The first descent was a ballet of terror. The rope she'd tied to a jagged boulder felt small against the ravine of air below. Her hands were raw from the morning's exertions. The cold bit into her fingers. But she descended carefully, rope squeaking, boots finding little holds, a mantra in her head about weight distribution and balance. A round cracked above her head. Someone had fired blind into the dark and knew she would be moving. The rock chipped from the proximity of the bullet. That sound, metal singing through air, was an intimate reminder of everything at stake. She hit a ledge half a town's width away from where she'd started and lay there for 2 breaths, tasting metal and dust, and a memory that was almost religious. The sound of rain on the hood of the Humvee when she was a kid, the lullaby her mother would hum when nights were loud. She did not have the luxury of mourning. She had to move. Her compass told her she was heading toward Granite Falls, a cluster of abandoned stone buildings that sat like ghosts on an older map. In daylight, it would be a death trap. Tonight, with the chaos above and clever use of shadow, it could be a hide. She moved like a ghost, careful of sound, careful of light. Her feet knew what to do even when her brain wanted sleep. The village was emptier than she'd imagined. Half roofs collapsed, graffiti on walls in languages she could only guess at. She slipped into the most intact building and cleared it with a speed that surprised her, past instincts honed by rooms of training and by the desperate need to be invisible. The corner she chose offered sightlines to the doorway and to the alley leading north. It also offered a wall to slide against if the worst came. She checked ammunition, 33 rounds now, rations tattered, water nearly gone. If extraction didn't happen, she'd be living on rationed small miracles and bitter coffee for days. That calculus, days of survival against the need to press on, made her dizzy. Outside, boots pounded. A search team swept the village with practiced efficiency. That sound, close, then receding, then close, had a rhythm she could measure against the beat of her heart. She waited when they looked right at her building. Silence was a physical thing she wore like cloaks and gloves. When they passed, her knees shook as she moved into the alley. She kept moving north. The valley had emptied. The SEALs had used her window to compress into the southern egress. Captain Parker had been meticulous, a soldier who knew how to move men without leaving meat on the road. Emma loved that in him, his unwillingness to treat people like variables. It was the rarest thing in war, someone who measured risk by lives, not badges. She had no direct channel to coordinate rendezvous with the SEALs now. Radio relay had been compromised and then re-established. Everything was a guess. Still, Parker's last voice had been certain. "You kept us alive. Don't let us find you dead, Sergeant." It wasn't an order, it was prayer. And prayers were heavy things to carry alone. The morning light turned color less forgiving as she reached the high ground north of Granite Falls. A line of ridgelines had been set up like teeth between her and the valley. They were methodically searching, trying to turn the trap inward. She watched them and noted patterns. The searchers moved in pairs, one with a flashlight and exposure, the other watching cover. They left small pauses where they listened for echoes and watched for breath on glass. That was when she saw him, Carter. He was not garish. He did not move like a movie villain. He moved like someone used to quiet planning, small, precise steps, hands light on his radio, eyes scanning the horizon with a machine's curiosity. He'd aged into a kind of calm that was more dangerous than rage. Intelligence had been right. Carter had once been a U.S. officer. He thought in American vectors and American institutionally trained ways. That made him predictable, and predicted things could be countered. Emma watched him from a rock, finger resting on her trigger. She could take him, the angles favored her. If she killed him, the hunt would waver. If she didn't, the hunt would continue. Carter had been clear: capture her alive. That meant he wanted leverage, intel, propaganda. He'd likely send a team to take her more than to kill her. The calculus screamed at her: eliminate the head and the beast falters. But the head's death might turn capture into a bloodbath below. She thought of the men consolidating at the southern egress, how their morale would sink or soar depending on the fate of their invisible benefactor. Her decision, again, would scale out into lives. She did something small and human. She breathed. Let him move. Let him make a mistake. Dalton's words echoed again: patience, then action. Carter's team pivoted. He pointed north, a small choreographed shift, and 3 men peeled off into a shallow ravine. They were going to cut her off. The trap she'd feared was assembling into a net. Her boots found a path that led down into a fold of earth. She crouched behind a half-collapsed wall and watched them pass, noses searching like hounds. In the half-second when their flashlights turned away, she rolled and sprinted north, keeping low, holding breath until the world turned into a thread, and then into silence, and then into movement again. She reached a small gully with a stream that had long been dry, mud cracked and old. The wash offered cover, and a way to move without being obvious from above. She headed deeper, the sun rising and tinting everything the color of knives. Her radio chirped unexpectedly, an encrypted channel she hadn't expected to hear. Sierra Whiskey, this is Outlaw 26, visual on hostile command grid. Recommend palletized suppression at grid coordinates transmitted. Standby for corridor clearance for extraction. Relief was a small, hot thing, immediate and guilty. Air power would clear a path. Extraction might happen. She had been betrayed by bureaucracy and then rescued by files and luck and the stubbornness of pilots who trusted a voice on the ground. She moved toward the coordinates, toward a ridge that would break line of sight. The Apache roared overhead, sound plate birds that tore the sky. Their sensors painted the hillside, and they fired in patterns that turned rock into dust and hope into smoke. The counter-sniper teams were under pressure. Men fell. The enemy's cohesion eroded, not gone but frayed. Then she heard a sound that made her stomach flip, a transmission low and amused in English. Do not shoot her if you find her. She is mine. Live capture. Bring her unharmed. Carter's voice, close enough to feel like a slap. Outlaw 26 had a different kind of bluntness. Negative, enemy commander. We engage threats. Stand by for corridor clear. Extraction in 15 minutes. Carter's tone chilled. Find her, not dead. So they would try to take her alive. They would use every deceptive, humble human tactic to do so. The battlefield had turned into a web with a prize in the center. She found a rock and sat down, hands on rifle, stomach hollow with the knowledge that her time was counted. She bought 300 men a chance. She had given them dignity. The rest, the politics, the reprimands, the unknown legal consequences, would come later. She let the sun warm her face for a single, private minute and thought about what she had chosen. About lines of sight and moral compasses, and the strange, hard clarity of acting when the system failed. The extraction would not be pretty. It would be bureaucratic, loud, and messy. But if she made it off that mountain, she'd face whatever came with the same steady breath that had gotten her this far. Some decisions don't create peace. They create motion, and motion, however small, is sometimes the only mercy left. She checked her ammo one last time, the small clink of rounds like a metronome. 30 were left. She shouldered her rifle. The valley below grunted and shifted. Men moved. A life she hadn't known until midnight had been altered by a single woman who decided not to obey an order she could not reconcile with the weight of blood. She had no illusions about tomorrow, but for now the small, stubborn math of survival had tilted toward life, and that was enough. How do you move forward when every shadow might be a promise or a trap? She told herself it was only distance, steps measured, terrain negotiated, 1 foot in front of the other. But every footfall felt like an ethical decision. Keep going and risk capture, stop and be found, run and risk falling into a prepared net. Emma left the gully with the steady patience of someone who had practiced disappearing. Her boots made no sound she could hear. The valley behind her breathed out smoke and ruin. The world ahead held skeletal ruins of granite falls and the thin promise of trees that might hide her until extraction. The Apache were working the ridgelines like angry gods. Their sensor sweeps created curtains of heat that forced the enemy's shadows to recede. That same light, however, pinned heat signatures to the bones of the land. No sanctuary was perfect. Her radio vibrated with the outlaw channel. Corridor suppression in effect. Recommend movement along the northern wash. ETA for helicopter insertion, 15 minutes. The words were precise, sterile, a corporate memo of salvation. She counted time in her head. 15 minutes was a small island of hope between two oceans of danger. She would reach the wash. She would survive, and then she'd have to survive the fallout. She moved north through a frame of stones, pausing at each bend to test the air, to listen for voices, for radios, for anything human that might betray the closeness of those who had been hunting her since night. On the ridge ahead, she could see movement, the angular silhouettes of men working methodically, combing the flats as if they were turning the pages of a book. Carter's men. They'd been instructed to take her alive. That meant they came with restraint and with ropes, and with the patience of men who prefer trophies to graves. Her chest caught when she watched one team cut across a wash and then pivot, as if some invisible cue had told them where to look. They had found a sign, her cached blanket, perhaps, or the disturbed scuff of fresh movement under stone. They moved like dogs with a scent. She had minutes, perhaps less. She thought of the men below, crammed into pockets of defensible terrain, moving with new purpose because a distant rifle had given them breath. Her hands tightened around the butt of her rifle, feeling the familiar weight of it like a promise. Metal, wood, destiny. She kept moving, moving with the economy of a thing that knew it was expendable. Her throat tasted of metal and adrenaline. The sky bled from pale to the harder colors of late morning as the Apache tore yards out of the landscape with ordnance and noise. The valley shifted. The men below moved toward the southern corridor in a slow, dangerous ballet, after-action soldiers learning to be alive. Emma had a plan that was both simple and monstrously complicated. Reach the wash, find a dead drop where Outlaw could mark a secure egress, move to the ridge, and then climb to a staging area where a US-60 would extract her. It was the kind of plan hatched under pressure, lean, ugly, and utterly dependent on timing. The creek bed she aimed for was a pale scar in the terrain, lined with scrub and clutching at the last of its seasonal water in muddled pools. It promised concealment but also a single approach road that would become a choke point if the enemy managed to flank her. She slipped into the pale bed and melted into the shadows of a collapsed stone wall. Her breathing slowed to careful counts. 1, 2, 3. In, 2, hold. She pressed herself against the coolness of the masonry like someone seeking absolution. From that concealment she watched Carter's team pivot and tighten a ring, folding inward with deliberate cruelty. They were patient, methodical, and she realized, not particularly panicked by the presence of an American sniper outside their kill zone. That meant they'd rehearsed this, had contingency plans for hunters, had trained for a long chase that ended in capture. The thought made something cold coil in her gut. She keyed her radio and spoke in the shortest syllables she'd used since leaving the JOCC. Outlaw, Sierra Whiskey, I'm moving into the wash. Your corridor clear. A crisp voice responded. Negative visual, Repeat corridor suppression is in effect. Move at your own risk. ETA for lift still 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Her stomach clenched. The math shrank. 10 minutes was a lifetime on a ridge and a death sentence on flat ground. She moved, low now, hands scraping rock and hot dust, letting each stone hide her shape. The sun paired shadows until they were thin lines and then almost gone. Heat swirled in viscous waves. A thought passed through her, irrational and sharp, of the children in the photos on her wall at the barracks, smiling with a kind of oblivious peace she had not known in years. She used that image as ballast and kept going. She reached the wash bend and found the dropped blanket still there, half covered with stones like a modest grave. It looked absurd and intimate, humanity's way of marking presence and absence. Carter's men were closing. The edge of her hearing caught the distant shout of a radio and the rise of bootbeats, closer than she'd allowed herself to imagine. She thought of an old rule from reconnaissance school: when you're being hunted, move toward complexity. The enemy can control obvious lanes. They cannot as easily govern a maze, a tangle of ruins and alleys where prediction breaks down. She crawled from the wash and into the skeleton of a house, the bones of it offering shadow and confusion. Moonlight had been merciless. Sun was a different beast altogether. From the low window she watched 3 men sweep across the road beyond the house. 2 paused near a collapsed porch, fingers on radios, heads bent, eyes scanning. The third crouched, his weapon sweeping the ground with the meticulous menace of a man used to looking for secrets. He was younger than she'd thought, too young to enjoy killing, too old to be forgiven. He moved with practiced cruelty, the kind of motion that terrifies because it bears no sign of hesitation. Emma did something small and precise. She tucked herself deeper into the window's shadow, breathing through the side of her mouth to minimize the sound. She pulled up a spare round and loaded it, feeling the barrel settle in the cradle of her arm like a living thing. Her finger found the trigger crease automatically. She did not aim for the heart. She aimed for the hands, for the way the man would become useless without his coordination. Disable, not kill. It was an ugly calculus, but one that preserved selves rather than bodies. The shot went like a small, private thunder. The man dropped like a sack of grain, a short, ragged sound escaping his chest. His partner whirled, a flashlight carving the night into a brutal spotlight. 2 shots snapped back. One chewed into the plaster near her head, throwing a shower of dust and slivers into the room. She moved like a whisper, rolling from the window and out through a back alley into a tangle of stone that offered more complexity. The hunt thickened. Radios whined and shouted in a language laced with anger and something rougher, pride. Carter's men were skilled enough to recover quickly. They sent a pair to fan out and search the village while the rest tightened the perimeter. This was the kind of decision that made her rethink options every minute: fight and be found, run and be hunted, hide and hope for better calculus somewhere above in the sky. She chose motion: crawl, sprint between cover, and always keep the relative angle of the sun to her back. She dropped into a culvert, moving on hands and knees until it spat her out into a dry riverbed beyond the village. The world opened up in brittle stretches of scrub and rock. She ran, not like someone trying to win, but like someone trying to stay an option for herself. Outlaw's voice came through like a promise. "Sierra Whiskey, you have a clear corridor 30 meters east. Move fast. We have visual on hostile teams repositioning." She stabbed into the corridor and ran until her lungs felt like knives. The ridge loomed ahead, rocky, steep, and littered with jagged outcroppings. If the hello could pick her up from the ridge, she would be alive. If she hesitated, she would be a prize. At the ridge's lip she paused, breath heaving, pulse a clockwork of ferocity. The air was thinner here, her vision tunneled for a beat. Then the sound changed. The rotor wash grew from distant rumble to immediate vibration. A pair of black hawks knifed through the sky, lowering like mechanical storks to a clearing. They were close enough now that she could hear the slap of wind on fabric and the indistinct shout of soldiers speaking into masks. She sprinted the final few meters and felt the world compress into a single brutal decision: go now or be taken. A shadow moved at the ridge's far edge, a silhouette that could have been a hunter, a sentinel, or death. Her boots hit dirt. She vaulted toward the landing zone with all the grace she could muster. The first set of boots hit before she reached the skids. Hands grabbed her, hauling her into the aircraft as ground turbulence and breathless pilots barked orders that she could not parse. The world turned into a series of tactile impressions. The howl of the rotor blades, the slap of wind, the taste of hot iron in her mouth, a soldier's palm rough with the oil of combat on her shoulder, the panicked shout of a pilot. Then they were airborne. For a few heartbeats, she felt nothing but motion and the small, private scream that sometimes follows a close thing, not yet resolved. Relief braided irretrievably with the knowledge that she had been hunted and nearly taken. She looked down through the open door and watched the ridge she'd crawled become a small line and then a memory. On the radio, Captain Parker's voice came raw and present. "Sierra Whiskey, report you with us." She answered, voice gravelly with exhaustion. "Affirmative, I'm aboard. Extraction successful." There was a silence that felt like a benediction. Then Parker's chuckle, strained but real. "Bring us home." She wanted to say something finer, something like, "We all did this. Not just me." Instead, she gave the smallest honesty she could muster. "I didn't do it for credit." The pilot grunted, "Ain't nobody asking." Above, the sky stretched and unrolled, vast and indifferent. Below it, the valley smoked and shrank, men moving like tiny, stubborn survivors. Emma pressed her forehead to the cool metal of the aircraft and closed her eyes. Relief came like a wave, and with it, the sharp spike of what would follow: investigations, arguments, career consequences, maybe praise and maybe prison. She had chosen to break orders because the moral ledger demanded action. She had done what she could for 300 men. One small truth rested like a stone in her palm. Some actions once taken cannot be undone. Consequences would arrive. She did not know whether history would call her disobedient or heroic. She did know this. On a mountain ridge, 30 feet below a summit, she had bought 300 men extra breaths. That would have to be enough. She looked toward the valley and whispered, not to the pilots or to the radio, but to something that had been with her the whole time, the photograph in her pocket, the memory of people who taught her to stand. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The helicopter lifted again into the blue, and for a moment the world held its breath with her. Why do the quiet moments after survival feel louder than the battle itself? When the rotors faded and the desert stopped shaking, there was only breath, hers, sharp and uneven, and the steady beep of a heartbeat monitor somewhere close. Emma Lawson opened her eyes to a ceiling painted the color of exhaustion. White tiles, fluorescent hum, the sterile smell of antiseptic and burned metal. A military field hospital, temporary and efficient, parked somewhere between the wreckage of Echo Valley and the bureaucracy of home. Her throat felt raw, her body heavier than memory. She tried to move and found a soft resistance. An IV line taped to her arm, a pulse oximeter on her finger, a shoulder strapped in a sling she didn't remember earning. A voice came from the right, calm and human. "You're awake." Major Lisa Hayes stood near the bed, her uniform creased, eyes bruised from sleeplessness. She looked older than Emma remembered from the briefing room. Less glass, more grit. "Where am I?" Emma's voice rasped like sand. "Forward triage base outside Kandahar. You've been out 12 hours. Hayes set a paper cup of water on the side tray. "You were dehydrated, underfed, and running on adrenaline. We stabilized you, but you'll need a few days." Emma drank, the water tasting faintly of plastic and relief. "The SEALs." Hayes exhaled through her nose, slow. 263 evacuated, 37 KIA. Without you, it would have been 300 dead, maybe all of them. Emma looked at her hands, calloused, still shaking slightly. She wanted to feel triumph or at least peace. Instead, she felt hollow. "And the brass?" Hayes half smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. The brass are trying to decide whether to court-martial you or build a statue. That earned the faintest laugh from Emma, dry and bitter. Figures. Hayes sat down, folding her cap in her lap. Colonel Reed's been reassigned. The investigation into the operational failure is ongoing. They're trying to bury the phrase tactical withdrawal. Emma stared at the ceiling again. They'll bury me with it. Maybe, Hayes leaned forward, but not quietly. There are too many witnesses now. Parker's men are talking. They're saying a Marine sniper saved them when everyone else went silent. They're not wrong. Emma closed her eyes. That's not why I did it. I know, Hayes said softly. That's why it matters. 2 days later, a C-17 carried her home. The flight was long, sleepless, and quiet. Dozens of soldiers in stretcher rows, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every breath you take. Outside, the horizon bled from gold to gray. Emma sat against the bulkhead, bandaged shoulder pressed to the cold metal, thinking of mountains that still smelled like cordite, of faces she never knew but somehow felt responsible for. When they landed, the airfield looked nothing like the desert. Rain slicked the tarmac. The cold wrapped around her like a reprimand. She was escorted not to rest, but to a windowless conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and career decisions. 3 officers sat behind a long table. An aide in khaki stood by the door. Sergeant Lawson, the senior officer, began. General McAdams, silver-haired, voice measured. You are aware of why you're here? Yes, sir. He nodded, hands folded. You acted without authorization. You left your assigned post, commandeered transport under false pretenses, engaged the enemy independently, and violated direct orders. That's insubordination at best, desertion under fire at worst. The words dropped like stones into a still pond. Emma didn't flinch, and 300 men came home because of it. McAdams stared at her, unblinking. That is not in dispute. The second officer, a JAG representative, leaned forward. The question before this board is whether intent and outcome mitigate the violation. Emma's throat tightened. Intent and outcome, words that turned morality into paperwork. Sir, she said carefully, I saw a plan that was going to fail. I spoke up. No one listened. I acted because every hour we delayed, more men died. I didn't disobey for glory. I disobeyed because following that order meant watching people die in silence. McAdams's gaze softened, just for a heartbeat. You understand, Sergeant, the chain of command is what holds the military together. Yes, sir, she said. But sometimes what holds it together isn't the chain. It's the people who remember why they wear it. Silence. Hayes, sitting in the back as an observer, met Emma's eyes and gave a small nod. After a long pause, McAdams spoke again. This board will review and render its findings. Until then, you are confined to quarters. No communication with the media, no contact with operational personnel. Emma saluted. Understood, sir. Her quarters were small, clean, impersonal. A bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over rain-wet tarmac. She sat there for hours that first night, staring at her reflection in the glass. The sling on her shoulder felt heavier than armor. Every sound of the storm reminded her of gunfire echoing off cliffs. Every flash of lightning brought back the flare of her scope. She could still hear Parker's voice, that impossible mix of gratitude and disbelief. You gave us a chance. The door knocked once. She turned. Major Hayes stepped in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. You're not sleeping, she said, as if it weren't a question. Emma accepted the cup. I forgot how to. Hayes sat on the edge of the desk. There's talk in the Pentagon. Public Affairs wants to spin this as a miscommunication, an intelligence breakdown. They'll never admit they ignored your warning. I don't need them to. Hayes studied her. What do you need? Emma thought about that for a long time, to believe it was worth it. Hayes nodded. It was. Emma looked out the window again. Tell that to the 37 who didn't make it. The major's voice softened. They would have been 300. Silence filled the room, thick, heavy, the kind that doesn't need to be broken. Hayes set her mug down, exhaled, and stood. I'll make sure they remember your name, Sergeant, whatever the board decides. Emma gave a small, tired smile. That's not the part that matters. Days turned into weeks. The hearing dragged on behind closed doors, testimonies, classified transcripts, the politics of perception. She wasn't allowed to attend, only to wait. Waiting was harder than climbing any mountain. When the verdict came, it was handed to her in a sealed envelope by a young lieutenant who looked uncomfortable being the messenger. She opened it slowly, read the words twice. Administrative reprimand, non-judicial action, reassignment to training division. No prison, no dishonorable discharge, just exile dressed as mercy. The lieutenant saluted. Orders effective immediately, Sergeant. Emma returned the salute, understood. When the door closed, she sat down on the edge of her bed and let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting a lifetime. Not victory, not defeat, just consequence. Her new assignment came 2 weeks later, sniper instructor Quantico. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same system that punished her now wanted her to teach others how to see what she saw, to think like ghosts in daylight, to decide when orders stopped being right. On her first day, she stood before a room of recruits, young, eager, unscarred, rows of faces waiting for wisdom. She started without notes. You've all been told to follow orders, she said quietly. And you should. 99% of the time, orders will save lives. But that 1%, she paused, eyes distant, that 1% will ask who you really are when no one's watching. The room was silent. They hung on her words like gravity. One day, she continued, you'll be out there. The radio will go dead. The plan will fall apart. And someone will be screaming for help while the people in charge argue about timing. When that day comes, listen to the voice that tells you what's right. The one that's harder to hear. The one that's yours. No one spoke. She didn't need them to. Afterward, one recruit, a young woman with eyes too old for her age, approached. Ma'am, she said hesitantly, did you really save 300 SEALs? Emma smiled faintly. No, I reminded them they didn't need saving. The recruit frowned, puzzled but moved. Emma clapped a hand on her shoulder. Go train, she said softly, and remember courage doesn't always sound like gunfire. As the recruits filed out, Emma stood alone for a while, the sunlight filtering through the classroom blinds like the soft stripes of another life. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the weight of consequence and fatigue, something began to settle, not peace, but acceptance. She acted when no one else would, and though the system would never say it aloud, history had a way of whispering truth long after people stopped listening. Emma Lawson had broken orders, but she hadn't broken faith. And that, she thought, was enough. Outside, rain began again, soft, persistent, steady. The kind that erases footprints but never the fact that someone walked there. She looked out across the field, past the rows of recruits marching in formation, and whispered to the glass, sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The storm swallowed her reflection, and the world moved on, quietly, relentlessly alive. Why is it that peace feels like a foreign country when you've lived too long at war? Emma Lawson woke before sunrise every morning. No alarms, no urgency, just the quiet compulsion of someone whose body no longer believed in rest. Quantico was calm, almost too calm. Dew clung to the grass like a secret. The air smelled of pine and gun oil. For most instructors it was routine, for her it was penance. She taught precision marksmanship now, 30 recruits at a time. Some looked at her with reverence, others with suspicion. Her reputation had leaked through the ranks like contraband, the sniper who disobeyed orders and saved 300 SEALs. Officially, it wasn't discussed. Unofficially, it was legend. She hated the word legend. It sounded clean. None of it had been clean. By 600, the range echoed with distant gunfire, measured, predictable, disciplined. She walked the line, correcting posture, watching shoulders tighten and relax. A young man on lane 7 flinched as his rifle kicked. She knelt beside him. "Breathe with it," she said quietly. "Don't fight it. Your weapon isn't angry at you. It's honest." He nodded, adjusted, and fired again. Center mass, perfect shot. Emma smiled faintly. "See, honesty's steady." She moved on. The recruits respected her, though she sensed they didn't fully understand her. How could they? They hadn't seen what it costs to be right at the wrong time. After hours, she stayed behind to clean rifles. It was habit, order in place of chaos. The light turned amber through the windows, and the sound of the brushes against steel felt almost like prayer. She was halfway through a barrel when the knock came. "Come in," she said without looking up. The door opened. A tall man stepped in, his posture crisp, his uniform navy. He had the look of someone who'd spent too much time between deployments, skin too pale for the stories in his eyes. "Captain Ethan Parker," he said, voice steady. "You probably don't remember me." She froze mid-motion, then slowly looked up. "I remember your voice." He smiled faintly. "You saved my team, Sergeant." She shook her head. "You saved yourselves, I just gave us a chance," he finished. "I remember your exact words. You said, 'They won't last 10 minutes. You were wrong. They lasted because you bought them an hour." Emma set the rifle down. "You shouldn't be here. They'll think you're part of the noise." "Let them think." Parker stepped closer, studying her face. "I tried to see you at the hearing, but they kept me out. Politics, optics, the same nonsense that got us killed." She sighed softly. "You're still fighting battles that don't exist anymore." Parker shook his head. "You think this is over?" Lawson, Echo Valley, on every ops forum, every internal review board. Your name's a line they whisper about, the sergeant who went rogue. Half of them call you a hero, the rest call you dangerous. Emma laughed quietly. "That's the military's favorite contradiction." He smiled. "Yeah, the system doesn't know what to do with people who think." Silence settled. The air between them was heavy with unspoken things, the smell of oil, the faint echo of explosions neither of them wanted to remember. Finally, Parker said, "One of my men wanted me to find you, Petty Officer Vale. You carried him in your scope's reflection. He lost his leg that day, but not his humor. He said if I ever saw you to tell you this. She didn't just save us. She made us remember why we fight." Emma's throat tightened. He made it out. "Yeah," Parker said softly. "Rehab in San Diego. He's learning to surf again." The image hit her harder than she expected. One-legged, scarred, laughing at the ocean. Hope wearing a limp. Parker leaned against the desk. "You know, I keep thinking about what you said, about math and lives, about choosing the 1% of moments when orders don't work." She gave a half-smile. "I wasn't trying to start a philosophy class." "Too late," he said. "You did." He looked out the window where recruits marched under gray sky. "They asked me to give a speech next week at the academy. I told them no. Then I thought of you." "Me?" "Yeah, you said something once. Sometimes the people who see the clearest are the ones nobody's looking at. I wanted them to hear that from someone who lived it." She studied him a moment. "What do you want from me, Captain?" He paused to say thank you. She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "That's the thing," Parker said quietly. "None of us do, but we still carry you with us. You became our reminder that the uniform means more than the order." His tone softened. "You think we'd let the world forget that?" Emma looked down, fingers tracing the grain of the desk. "They'll rewrite it anyway. They always do." "Maybe," Parker said, "but stories have a way of surviving orders." That night Emma sat alone outside her barracks, coffee in hand, the Virginia air cool against her skin. The stars were faint, lost to base lights, but she found the constellations anyway, filling in the blanks with memory. Echo Valley lived behind her eyelids, permanent as a scar, but now it carried something else, faces she'd never seen but somehow carried. Vale, Parker, the laughter she'd overheard on the comms before the first explosion, the sound of survival. She thought of her parents again, the way her mother's voice had sounded when she said, "Doing the right thing doesn't mean you'll be thanked for it." She whispered into the dark, "You were right, Mom." The following week, Quantico hosted a joint training review. Officers, instructors, and visiting brass filled the stands. Rows of cadets waited, rifles at rest, eyes straight ahead. Emma stood at the range edge, clipboard in hand. Hayes had told her to look professional and stay invisible. But invisibility had never fit her well. Midway through the event, a hush fell over the crowd. Captain Ethan Parker stepped onto the platform. He wasn't supposed to be there. Emma could tell from the confused looks among the staff. He didn't salute or posture. He simply looked out at the recruits. "Some of you think orders are the law," he began. "You're not wrong, but the law is only as strong as the conscience of the one who follows it." Emma froze. Parker continued, his voice carrying across the field. "Last year, I watched 300 men trapped in a valley because command believed the data instead of the terrain. We were saved not by luck or by command, but by one Marine who refused to stand down." A murmur rippled through the ranks. "She broke orders," Parker said, "but she didn't break faith. She reminded us that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, 'Move anyway.'" The general overseeing the event shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. Parker glanced toward Emma. For a second their eyes met. No ceremony, no salute, just mutual recognition of something larger than both of them. Then he finished simply, "You'll hear a lot about leadership in your careers, but if you remember anything, remember this. Orders tell you what to do. Integrity tells you why." He stepped back, saluted, and walked off the stage before anyone could stop him. The recruits erupted in applause. The officers pretended to be annoyed. And Emma Lawson stood there, her throat burning, her clipboard suddenly feeling heavier than her rifle ever had. Later that evening, she found Parker standing near the edge of the training field, watching the recruits pack up. "They'll reprimand you for that," she said. He smiled faintly. "Already did, but worth it. You just signed your own transfer." "Maybe, but maybe I reminded a few people that obedience without conscience isn't service, it's surrender." She studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You shouldn't have done that for me." "I didn't," he replied. "I did it for everyone who'll face that 1% moment and need to remember your name." He turned to leave, then stopped. "You ever think about going back out there?" "Every day," she admitted, "but not with a rifle." He nodded, understanding without needing explanation. "If you ever do, just know you won't be alone." She smiled softly, "Neither will you." He walked away, the fading sunset wrapping him in gold. Emma watched until he disappeared over the rise. Then she looked out at the empty field. The recruits' footprints dotted the dirt, temporary, imperfect, already fading under the wind. But she knew better than to believe in erasure. Footprints always led somewhere, even if the next rain tried to hide them. She closed her eyes, breathed in the cool air, and let it fill her with something she hadn't felt in months, quiet pride. Not in the act, not in the defiance, but in the proof that decency could still echo through uniforms and rules. Sometimes the system didn't change. Sometimes it did, quietly in whispers, through people brave enough to act when it mattered. She tilted her head back toward the night sky, whispering a thought that felt more like a promise. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And somewhere far away in the silence that follows courage, the world listened. Why do the hardest wars always begin after the shooting stops? That question haunted Emma Lawson in the quiet years that followed, the kind of silence that doesn't heal, only echoes. Her reassignment at Quantico had turned permanent. She had gone from a story whispered in corridors to a name filed in policy memos under exceptional cases. When the Navy SEALs published their after-action report, the official language called her a field element who acted in exigent circumstances to mitigate command latency. She smiled when she read it. It was the government's way of saying she saved them because we froze. But there were nights when none of it mattered, when she woke to the smell of dust and metal, the ghost of a trigger under her finger, the old valley replaying in monochrome. She'd sit on the edge of the bed, hands shaking, whispering to the dark. They made it out. That's enough. Enough was a hard word. It meant survival, not peace. Years folded in on themselves. She grew into a rhythm that was almost normal. Daylight meant teaching. Evenings meant cleaning weapons, grading reports, pretending normalcy was a skill. One winter morning, the commandant's aide appeared in her classroom doorway. "Sergeant Lawson, you're requested in D.C. for review panel attendance. Civil oversight." She frowned. "Am I under review again?" "Not exactly. They want context." Context, another polite word for story. The Pentagon felt colder than the mountains ever had. The hallways gleamed with polish and bureaucracy. She sat before a long table where senators, analysts, and military historians regarded her like a puzzle that refused to fit into any box they'd built. "Sergeant Lawson," the chairwoman began, "we're conducting an ethics review of battlefield decision-making autonomy. Your experience has become illustrative." Emma gave a small nod. "You mean controversial." The room chuckled lightly, but the woman's eyes were steady. "We want to know, if you could relive that moment, would you still disobey?" Emma thought of the radio static, the screams, the maps, the silence that had filled the command tent while men died. She let the pause stretch until the quiet hurt. "Yes," she said finally, "because right is sometimes louder than orders." A senator cleared his throat. "And how do you teach that without encouraging anarchy?" "You don't," she said. "You teach judgment. Judgment comes from empathy, not ego." There was a long silence. Someone scribbled notes, someone else nodded. The chairwoman leaned back. "Thank you, Sergeant, that's all." As Emma rose to leave, the older woman stopped her. "For what it's worth, my son was in Echo Valley." Emma met her eyes. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Months later, the story leaked. Not classified files, just whispers that caught wind and became words on screens. Marine sniper saved 300 SEALs. The woman who said F the orders. Headlines without context. Sound bites without consequence. Her phone filled with messages she didn't answer. Journalists camped outside the gate. Politicians turned her defiance into slogans. She ignored all of it until a small envelope arrived at her post office box. No return address. Inside, a letter written in careful, uneven handwriting. "Ma'am, you don't know me. My father was Lieutenant Vale. You saved him that day. He passed away last month from complications, but he told me before he died that when the world goes quiet, to look for people like you, people who act when others wait. He said to tell you that you were his proof that courage isn't loud. Thank you. Maya Vale, age 12. Emma read it twice, then a third time, the ink blurring slightly where her thumb pressed too long. That evening she walked to the range long after everyone else had gone. Snow fell in slow, soundless flakes, turning the field white. She set up a single target, no score, no record. She lay prone, breathed in, exhaled. The rifle barked once, echoing off the hills. Through the scope she saw the whole dead center. The shot was clean, too clean. It felt like goodbye. She smiled, set the rifle down, and just watched the snow. For the first time in years she let herself do nothing. No tactics, no consequence, just presence. Spring came. The letters kept arriving, not from reporters but from families. Some wrote about the sons and brothers she'd saved. Some wrote about the ones she hadn't. She answered each one by hand. She didn't promise comfort, she offered truth. Your son fought well. He was brave. We all owe him more than silence. Over time, her replies became less about war and more about what it leaves behind. How bravery and regret can share the same skin. Hayes visited sometimes, now retired and looser in spirit. They'd sit on the porch outside the instructor's quarters, coffee between them, silence doing most of the talking. You ever regret it? Hayes asked one evening. Emma thought for a while. Every day, she said, and never once. Hayes smiled. That's how I know you're still human. Years later, they invited her to a memorial dedication at Arlington. The monument was simple, a low wall etched with names, a quote underneath, words she hadn't written but recognized anyway. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She stood before it, the crowd behind her murmuring like wind through leaves. Parker was there too, gray at the temples now, in dress blues, his medals catching the sunlight like little fragments of yesterday. When the speeches ended, he walked over. They used your words, he said quietly. They were never mine, she replied. They belonged to all of us. He smiled, the same weary one she'd seen in that desert long ago. You ever think about what comes next? She looked up at the sky, soft blue, unthreatening. Something quieter, maybe. Writing, teaching. She shrugged, living. He nodded, you've earned that. They stood in silence as the honor guard saluted and the bugle played. The last note hung in the air longer than sound should be able to. That night back in her quarters, Emma opened the small box that held everything she'd kept from the war. A pair of dog tags, a spent shell casing from Eagle Peak, a photograph of her parents, and the letter from Maya Vale, folded and refolded until the edges frayed. She added a note of her own, written in neat block letters. For whoever finds this, you don't owe the world obedience, you owe it honesty. Then she placed the note on top and closed the lid. She sat by the window as dawn began to bloom, soft and slow. The world outside moved in its ordinary rhythm, trucks, recruits, flags stirring in early wind. She smiled faintly. The war had ended, not cleanly, not completely, but enough. And as the sunlight caught the edges of the wall in the distance, she whispered one last truth, to herself, to the ghosts, to the silence that had become her oldest friend. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The light touched her face, warm and steady. And for the first time in years, Emma Lawson let herself believe she was home.